Hey, everybody. We are on Unit 2, Session 4. So we're on Unit 2, Session 4 this week for our video. This is the last session in Unit 2, and we're talking about the Tower of Babel. Very interesting story, not an often talked about story, believe it or not. So your scripture this week, again, it's in the curriculum, but it's Genesis 10:32 through chapter 11, verse 4, or actually chapter 11, verse 9. So 10:32 through 11:9. And then there's a reference to Isaiah 65, 1 and 2. It kind of gets us to more of an application type point that we'll get to. Again, your points are solid this week. However, I think I'm going to give a few different points in them just because I feel like some of these points don't necessarily get to your points in the curriculum, at least, don't really get to the kind of the fullness of the text that I think is important for us to understand. So definitely use those, but also use these at your disposal if you'd like to as well. So when we think about the Tower of Babel, we have to remember when it takes place, and it takes place after the flood, likely several generations after the flood, as you know, there was only 8 people in the world after the flood, and so it took some time to repopulate the earth. But point number one is that the flood didn't eliminate human nature. All right, so the flood did not eliminate human nature. This is important because God judged the world and he wiped it out and left just the righteous people on the earth, being Noah and his family. However, human nature is always going to be to sin. It's always going to be to turn against what is good and what God has for us. And you see that in the Tower of Babel, right? They allow their own pride to say, let's make a name for ourselves. Let's make us famous instead of making God famous. And that's the first flaw that you see in the story. Secondly, when God intervenes, he intervenes in a unique way. And so point number 2 being God's grace doesn't always look like grace. God's grace doesn't always look like grace. To the people that were being recipients of this language that was being confused. So essentially they all spoke one language, and then God said, you know what, the way I'm going to stop this is I'm going to confuse their minds, and they're going to all speak different languages, which is really interesting and actually a pretty genius way to handle that, right? And so God does that, and they begin to speak different languages, and he confuses them. And for us, we look at that, and I'm sure the people looked at that, and they didn't see that as an act of grace. They may have seen that as an act of judgment. But oftentimes God's act of judgment is his acts of grace. I mean, imagine if God would have just let that play out. I mean, who knows what would have happened to them? You know, who knows what would have happened to the people and how much further away they would walk away from the way God designed their human hearts to be. And so God's grace doesn't always look like grace. Maybe sometimes it comes through even what seems to be judgment. And then finally, if you flip over to Isaiah 65, don't ignore that text. It's a really good text, and it's talking about in the context of Israel and Israel's continual tendency to fall away from the heart of God and to chase after what their own desires were. And so the third point would be, don't follow your heart, follow God's heart. Don't follow your heart, follow God's heart. And this is kind of an attack on a phrase that our society likes to throw out a lot, is follow your heart, you know, or follow your thoughts, right? Like, what do you think would be good, or follow, just do what you want to do. And that comes from a sincere understanding of like, hey, like, don't let anybody else define what you want to do. You define what you want to do. But when we come down to it, when we do that, we're moving away from the way God designed us. God designed us to be image bearers, to seek after the things that glorify him. And so we're supposed to be people that seek God's heart. You see, Israel is a picture of us. In the same way that their heart would wander and that their heart would stray away from the things of the Lord, that's what we do all the time. We're so distracted. And we live in a world that offers us so many things that compete for our attention. And if we're not careful, we can quickly find ourselves following our own hearts instead of God's heart, just like the Israelites did. And here in Genesis 10 and 11, just like these people did after the flood, right? And so I hope that helps you this week. Like I said, I know it's not a super familiar story. However, it's an interesting story, and there's some really cool pictures of God's grace in the midst of of his judgment here as well. So hope that helps you guys this week. Have a great week, and we'll see you Sunday.